Hey everyone, for people just joining us, we're going to give it a couple minutes, but if you want to say hello in the chat, that'd be great. See a few people saying hello there. Hey Shar, hey Bob. We are recording this session, so just so you know, if you have to leave early, you can always watch the full thing a little bit later on. We'll send it around sometime next week, and we'll give it a couple more minutes here. Hey John, hey Carol, hi Lindsay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being with us today. We are very excited to be hosting a special municipal event in partnership with the Parkland Institute and some special guests with Public Interest Alberta. It's part of our broader municipal election engagement called A Better Future for All. And we're featuring some candidate engagement from candidates across the province on key issues related to the public interest. And we're so happy you could join us this evening. My name is Bradley LaFortune. I'm the Executive Director here at Public Interest Alberta. My pronouns are he, him, and I am very excited to be hearing from our researchers and special guests tonight. Just before we get started today, it's very important for us here at Public Interest Alberta and the Parkland Institute to acknowledge and honor our Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit partners who have come here before us, and those who are here with us now who continue to care for the land here in Alberta and across Turtle Island. I am personally an uninvited settler here on Treaty 6 territory in what is now called Edmonton, and I recognize the care and wisdom that Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit people have brought for the land, the air, the water, and the trees here. This particular area of Treaty 6 is traditional meeting ground for the Cree, Saulteaux, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux, and specifically the ancestral space of the Papas Chase Cree Nation as well. Personally, over the years, I just want to recognize the honor it's been to get to know some of my brothers and sisters over the years who have taught me a great deal about what it means to be a settler here and a treaty person on Treaty 6, including the fantastic new MP for Edmonton-Griesbach, Blake Desjardins, who is in Ottawa for the first time this week. We're so excited that he got elected, and so many others as well. They've taught us that this is a very important place, often referred to as Pehonan, an important gathering place where people came for many, many centuries and generations to share ideas, wisdom, and goods. And so tonight I invite us all to meditate on what it means to be treaty people and to be gathering here on Treaty 6, 7, 8, 10, and across Turtle Island so that we can recognize the full knowledge of our real history and the responsibility that we bear to one another as settlers and as treaty people. So just a little note on housekeeping. We want to have a pretty engaged and lively event here, so I'm going to try to not talk too much. We're all tired of Zoom already anyway. PIA is a very safe, welcoming space, and we have a strong ethic and commitment to treating one another with respect. So, you know, I'm sure we're all coming here with love and with curiosity. So feel free to ask all of your questions, and we'll do our very best to get to them. And don't be shy. We really want to hear from everybody today once we get through the presentations and have a good engaged dialogue. Just be sure to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can enter your questions, and me and my colleague Laura will do our best to get to them as soon as we can. And just a note on accessibility, we will have captions enabled for this session. They're automatically generated, as I'm sure you've seen before in Zoom and other spaces, so they won't be perfect, but they're better than nothing, so we do have that going as well. One final note before we do introductions here. It's municipal election season. If you haven't voted early, go do that now. You have it up until October 18th, but it's a really exciting time for us in our province. There's a lot of issues that are on the table that we're really concerned about and excited about, especially when it comes to how our elections are funded, which we're going to hear about from a couple of our guests tonight, as well as how the relationship between our province and our municipalities, in our cities, in our communities is really impacted by decisions by provincial governments and has been for several years. So we're very excited to hear about that. And we're very fortunate to have some impressive guests with us tonight to talk about those questions and issues and find a way for us all to move forward so we can create a better future for all Albertans. First up, we're going to explore the issue of cuts and funding to municipalities with Dr. Peterson. So Dr. Jacqueline Peterson is here with us all the way from Brooks by way of the University of Toronto. She has her PhD from the University of Toronto in political science from 2020. Her research focuses on urban infrastructure, multi-level governance, local climate change policy, and municipal finance in Canada and the US. Her frequently published research includes the Parkland Institute's recent report, which we're here to hear about tonight, called An Unfair Deal, the impact of provincial cuts on municipalities, and an upcoming book, which is very exciting, from McGill Queen's University Press. Welcome, Dr. Peterson, and I'll turn it over to you. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bradley. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. I do have some slides if you want me to share them. I'm also happy just to talk. Sorry.
It's totally up to you, Jacqueline. If you want to share your screen, you can, or if you want to talk, we're just we're putty in your hands.
Okay, I don't have screen sharing capabilities. Sorry, I should have tested this earlier. Anyways, you can tell me when that's good to go, and I'll just start talking in the meantime. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I really want to thank all of you and Public Interest Alberta to inviting me here today and to the event. I see it should be working now. Okay, perfect. So I'm delighted to be here today to discuss, as Bradley was saying, my latest research on municipal provincial relations, which was published, I guess, about 2 weeks ago now by the Parkland Institute. The report itself is titled An Unfair Deal, the Impact of Provincial Cuts on Alberta's Municipalities. So today I'll be providing just some of the high-level takeaways of the report. And as is always the case, there's a lot more detail in the report itself, which I believe we'll be sharing here tonight. And I really encourage you to read it, circulate it, ask for questions. So as now likely you're all very well aware, Alberta's 2021 municipal elections are now less than 2 weeks away. As Bradley was mentioning, advanced polls are open, and I know that there's lots of people out there, including, I'm sure, many people in the audience today, who are looking to make informed decisions on the many choices available to them. And you do have a lot of choices on the ballot this year. So we were compelled to write this report and release it in advance of Alberta's municipal elections because, quite frankly, cities matter. Municipal elections matter. The outcomes of these elections have very direct and meaningful consequences on our everyday lives, right? On the quality and breadth of city services, our tax rates, local jobs, the local economy, truly what the future of our cities will look like. But these municipal decisions aren't made by local councils alone. In fact, provincial policy has very direct and meaningful impacts on the options available to local governments. And while many people recognize the roles that your local councillors and mayors will have on the changes you see in your cities, I would argue that a much smaller portion of the public is aware of the critical role played by the province in really shaping these decisions. So this is really what this report tries to do, is highlight to voters the very real ways provincial policy, and most notably recent budgetary decisions made by the UCP government, influence local outcomes and shape the options available to cities. So over the past several months, I interviewed municipal leaders across Alberta, councillors, mayors, city employees, on the specific impacts provincial policy has had in their communities. with a particular focus on the province's impact on local finances. So this can be either through provincial grants and transfers, or by the province setting the rules on local taxes, buying revenue options, and how cities can really generate revenue in the first place. So over the past few years, cities, towns, rural municipalities across Alberta have really been squeezed by the province, which has reduced several key sources of revenue that cities have traditionally relied upon. So first and foremost, the most recent 2021 provincial budget outlined significant decreases in infrastructure funding to Alberta's municipalities over the next several years. The province's largest capital grant program is called Municipal Sustainability Initiative, or often colloquially MSI, is not only being cut by 330 million, but the funding is also being drawn out 2 years longer than was originally anticipated. I mean, like one of the interviewees that I had likened this to not only cutting your child's weekly allowance, but telling them that you would pay it back now over 2 weeks instead of 1. So under the NDP government, the MSI was set to be replaced in 2022 with the city charter's fiscal framework, which really was a more collaborative partnership approach to the province's relationship with Alberta's biggest cities, Calgary and Edmonton, and really was kind of aiming to give them a bit more responsibility and predictability when it came to funding, because this city charter's fiscal framework also included a revenue sharing component. In 2019, though, the UCP decided to shelve this city charters framework and replaced it instead with the local government fiscal framework, or LGFF. There's a few acronyms going on here now, which is set to begin in 2024. But not only does the LGFF provide cities with a lower base annual funding, so it's now 722 million a year, down from 860, but also the revenue sharing component is also substantially reduced. And just to put this 330 million reduction of MSI funding, or the 138 million yearly decrease in LGFF base funding into kind of context, because I know once you start talking about, 5, 10 million, like what do these numbers mean? They're so large, right? So comparing 330 million, for instance, to Medicine Hat's entire capital budget for 2021 was 25 million. So less than 10% of that. The total cost of maintaining all of Edmonton's roads, alleys, sidewalks, interchanges, bridges, 100 plus streetlights in a year, this averages less than 100 million. So really, when we're talking about these numbers, 330 or 138 million yearly, these are really huge numbers. And so ultimately, as a result of decreased infrastructure funding, cities are having to delay critical infrastructure projects. And sometimes this can really be indefinitely, right? All right, so cuts to infrastructure have certainly been the biggest and kind of the most visible of the province's cuts. And this is largely due to the fact that most provincial transfers are really for infrastructure. However, the province has also taken a number of measures that impact local operating revenues, or the revenues cities rely on to provide day-to-day services. So one of these prominent decreases in revenue are changes to municipalities' share of police fine revenue. So municipalities used to, I know probably many of you here just think that the money that the police collect from fines, photo radar, all these things just go to your local police department, but actually a chunk of this goes to the province as well. So traditionally, municipalities were able to retain about 3/4 of this fine revenue, or 73%. This has now decreased to 60%, which has resulted in a net loss of 37 million to Alberta's municipalities. Another big issue that was raised was a decrease in payments through this somewhat obscure sounding program. It's called the Grants in Place of Taxes program, which was originally 57.7 million in 2018 and has now been reduced to 30 million in 2021. And this program is essentially how the province pays its property tax to municipalities and pays for the services cities provide to provincial properties. Because the provincial properties don't really pay municipal property tax themselves. So these funds through this Grants in Place of Taxes program are meant to pay for, the streets to be cleared in front of provincial buildings, for fire, police to respond to emergencies, for sidewalks to be put in, all these sorts of things. The list goes on. So when the province doesn't adequately cover these basic municipal services and pay its share of property taxes, it ultimately falls on municipal taxpayers then to pick up the tab, right? So whenever and however operating revenues are squeezed, cities are always inevitably placed in the position of either having to cut services, and often this means jobs, or raise taxes in order to cover these reductions in revenue. So municipalities across Alberta have been impacted by these changes, some in different ways, and in some very similar ways. And in this report, I highlight some of the specific impacts on Alberta's largest cities and include one-page fact sheets for both Calgary and Edmonton that I encourage you to take a look at. So while there are certainly kind of slight differences between the two, really what I really want to impress upon is that at the end of the day, both cities are looking at receiving about 400 million less than they were originally anticipating by 2024. And then beginning in 2024, they're going to start receiving 33 million less per year than was originally planned under the city charters framework. Okay, so sorry about this. So when discussing, where's my notes here? These cuts with municipal leaders across Alberta, there were really 5 key themes or trends that were constantly raised. So first was that the province really acted more like parents to municipalities rather than partners. There's always, of course, been this hierarchical relationship between municipalities and the province. And it's true, right? There is this institutional power imbalance between the two. That being said, interviewees really notice that there's really been a deterioration of collaboration and consultation over the past few years. A number of interviewees intimated to me that the province just really doesn't seem to get it. Meaning they don't really even understand what municipalities do. And second, they don't really see why it is so critical to engage with municipalities and collaborate with them in order to achieve shared goals. And I mean, just as a side note, this kind of lack of partnership really seemed to bother municipal leaders, I would say even almost as much as the cuts and decreases to funding. Many acknowledge that yes, we are in tough economic times, and that now more than ever, especially in a pandemic, we really need these 2 levels of government to be coming together, coming to the table, seeing eye to eye, and trying to really find creative solutions to problems. And this just really isn't happening right now. Second, the province has failed to really fully leverage federal funding. So to access federal funding, most federal programs require that municipalities, the province, and the federal government each pay 1/3 of the the project's costs. In this research that's detailed kind of in this report, a recurring theme was that many federal funding opportunities available to municipalities from the federal government, from affordable housing to transit to rural broadband, have been delayed or unsuccessful due to a lack of provincial partnership and willingness to, contribute their share. I mean, this is especially ironic considering this kind of ever-present argument and rhetoric out there that Alberta isn't getting a fair deal or its fair share from Ottawa. Third, interviewees constantly stress that delayed and inconsistent funding does more than just push back a project start date. In many cases, it can force cities to absorb high debt financing costs, which again are invariably paid for out of taxpayers' pockets. There's also high administrative costs as well. Like, an interesting example is that municipalities in Alberta are required by the province to set and create 3-year operating and 5-year capital budgets. So when the province changes its transfers to municipalities, as has been the norm as of late, cities are finding themselves in the position of having to redo their budgets, something that takes a lot of time and resources. Fourth up is what I call the municipal ripple effect. And that's just to say that provincial decisions in other policy areas often come with an indirect impact on municipalities, whether that's the whether that's the province's pandemic response, cuts to post-secondary institutions and the public workforce. All of these impact local communities and local economies. And then just finally, interviewees really drove home the need to rethink municipal finances and municipal provincial relations and give municipalities the tools they need to properly invest in the future of their communities, particularly in this day and age, right, where people now can work from anywhere. So cities, communities are really competing globally for talent. In order to be an attractive place for talent, for investment, and just a great place to live, you really need this true partnership and this collaborative approach between cities and the province. Okay, so this is all well and fine, but what does this mean for voters heading to the polls on October 18th? So candidates, of course, make big promises about what they'll do, about what taxes they'll cut, about what efficiencies they might find. But it's critical for voters to know that these decisions aren't really theirs alone to make, right? That actions made by the province impact the feasibility of many of these positions. So first, voters should really be aware that they're voting for someone who understands that these complex governance dynamics exist and have policy positions to reflect this, right? And then voters should vote for candidates that have a strategy to navigate these dynamics and who they think will be able to represent themselves well on that provincial stage, right? Whether that's to advocate, to fight for cities, to work with the province. I also hope to show in this report the importance of really investing in our communities and the very strong impact that municipal services have on our day-to-day lives, and importantly, our future prosperity, our children's well-being. In this day and age, cutting services, delaying critical pieces of infrastructure through austerity approaches, this isn't going to help raise our city's global profiles, right? It's not going to help attract critical talent and investment. And it's also likely to lead to increased costs for our children down the road as we neglect these core maintenance investments and whatnot. So voters really need to keep this in mind at the ballot box as well. And finally, just in closing, I really hope to have demonstrated in this report, maybe more than anything, that municipal issues are not just the concern of the municipal voter, but the provincial voter as well, of which you are all both. So demand more of your provincial MLAs when it comes to our cities. I believe if you show that it's a priority for you, it will become a priority for them. All right, so I'm going to leave it there for now, but thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Great, thanks very much, Jacqueline. That was fantastic, and I really appreciate your insights into the need for a real conversation, maybe again, about how we can have a different sort of relationship between our municipalities and the province. It's pretty paternalistic, and it has been for a long time. We'll get to questions for sure, but that was fantastic. Our next two speakers are going to present on a different but really important aspect of the municipal election and municipal politics, which is election financing and how we're going to get what we call dark money out of Alberta politics, and kind of what the current state of affairs is in this municipal election. So first of all, we have Sae Yousefi. She is the co-author of this Parkland Institute fact sheet that is coming out very soon. So we're kind of getting a sneak peek this evening on municipal campaign finances. She's an MA student in the political science program at the University of Alberta, and she's a recent graduate of the Peace, Conflict, and Justice Studies program at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Sae. And Bill Kilgannon is probably no stranger to a lot of the folks in the room here today. He is PIA's founding executive director, and after working for PIA, leading the ship, he moved over to serve as the chief of staff to 3 NDP ministers during their term in government. And he's presently the executive director of the Parkland Institute and the co-founder of a company called Real Impact, which is a campaign agency dedicated to positive social change. So welcome to Sae and Bill, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. It's great to be here and back in my old role as executive director of the Parkland Institute. I'm back now for 2 years, while Ricardo Acuna is the president of the Faculty Association at the University of Alberta. So I'm very pleased to be back in this role and to be working with people like Jacqueline and Sae for this. We're happy to partner with Public Interest Alberta tonight to present this research that we are just wrapping up and hope to be putting out next week. We're hoping that there's no journalists on tonight that is going to scoop us when we go to do our press conference next week. So, but all of you will get a chance to be able to see the work that Sae in particular has done. It's been fantastic working with Sae on this project, and we look forward to it. So we needed to limit our research for this fact sheet just to the campaign contributions for candidates and focused on the results from the 2017 election, because we were able to access all of that data that was there. We know many people are also interested in political action committee fundings and third-party advertisers. And so hopefully we'll be able to get to that in the Q&A when we go forward. So I am just going to share my screen here. Hopefully this works fine for folks, because we have a number of things to present tonight. There we are. That's a good question for us. Why does this matter to our democracy? Why should we care about campaign finance rules and who funds our campaigns? So for me, I think one of the key things to consider is that many people don't even decide to run for council because they feel they cannot raise enough funds. Maybe they're not well off themselves, don't have a lot of rich friends, etc. And so that limits the diversity of people, often particularly impacting on the number of women who will choose to run going forward. We also can see that some candidates, not all, but some candidates may adjust their policy positions to try to attract more support from wealthy people and their businesses. So we see that as a result of that, we can see in our elections right now, there are a number of candidates who are calling for cuts to business taxes, while also saying we need to cut public services going forward. And so they're trying to play to those people who have very deep pockets, who want to make sure that their business taxes are cut. So candidates who do not have the same financial resources are not able to promote their ideas and visions and are not taken as seriously as candidates who are running full, well-funded campaigns. I think most people here tonight understand that you need a lot of money in order to run a successful candidate for mayor or city council. And so that money and how much they raise really matters. So, as you'll see tonight, the campaign finance rules are giving a huge advantage to incumbents going forward. So what are the campaign finance rules of what's called the Local Areas Elections Act? That is a provincial government piece of legislation. And the figures that I will show you are all from the 2017 election, the last election, for Alberta's top 4 cities. But what's important to know is that well, the NDP government changed the campaign finance rules in 2015. In fact, it was the very first law that they brought in for provincial elections. The changes the NDP government brought into the Local Areas Elections Act came in 2018. So the last election were not run under those rules. But what were those changes? The NDP said we must stop corporations and unions from being able to contribute to candidates. They set the limit at $4,000 that an individual can contribute to all candidates. So if you had 4 friends and you wanted to give them all $1,000, that's okay. Or if you happen to have 40 friends, you can, et cetera, et cetera. But the maximum you can contribute individually is $4,000. Reducing how much a candidate can contribute to their own campaigns to $4,000. It used to be $10,000. The NDP dropped it down to $4,000. We'll see what the UCP did with that. And surplus funds from previous campaigns were no longer allowed to be carried over to future campaigns. As we'll see in some of the disclosures that say, we talk about a lot of the incumbent campaigns had significant reserves that they just brought forward from the previous election to the 2017 election, making it very unfair. And only allowing candidates to start fundraising funds once they were nominated after the January in the year of the election. Candidates were allowed to raise a maximum of $2,000 prior to the election period from other contributions or through their own self-funding. So they could raise a couple $1,000s before that January 1st, 2021 election, if those rules were in place. But now that, so we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then requiring candidates to disclose campaign contributions over $50. The previous rules were anything over $100. So, and allowing for the creation of campaign expense limits to be set by regulation through consultation with municipalities and stakeholders. So the NDP put that into the legislation, and we're going to consult and bring in campaign spending limits, but that was going to come through regulation, not in the Act. And finally, to give the power to investigate potential breaches of the Act to the Election Commissioner. As we all know, in 2019, the UCP government came to power, and they brought in 2 bills after that, Bills 29 and 45. And they've changed the rules that this election on October 18th are now going to be run on. So now individuals can contribute $5,000 to as many candidates as you want. I know a lot of you out there have, $5,000 to throw around all the time to all of your different candidate friends. But for those of you who are wealthy, that might be a possibility. So that's the new rule going forward. Candidates can also now go back to contributing $10,000 to their own campaign, up from what the NDP put in at $4,000. And candidates can raise up to $5,000 from contributors in each year prior to the election, plus contribute $10,000 to their own funds. So when you think about it, if you were an incumbent candidate and you wanted to plan for 3 years, 4 years from now, you could put $10,000 of your own money in, raise $5,000 every year. And by the time that January 1st deadline rolled around, you would have $45,000 already in your account. They did not create any regulations to create a campaign expenditure limits going forward. So those are the rules that we have going forward. And then I'm now going to turn it over to Saye to talk about the findings that she's had from the 2017 election. Over to you, Sai.
Thanks a lot, Bill. I'll just share my screen again. 1 second. Okay, so like Bill said, I'm going to be talking a bit about, first of all, how much candidates actually raised across cities, and then about where these donations were coming from, and then I'll touch a bit on some of the major discrepancies and election law violations that we noticed when we did this analysis. So first off, how much money did candidates raise in their campaigns? So this graph here, the first figure, shows us the total amount of money that was raised across the 4 largest Albertan cities. So first off, you can see that the total campaign contributions in Calgary at about $5.4 million were more than double the total amounts raised in Edmonton, which was around just over $2 million. And then the very, very different amounts raised by Lethbridge and Red Deer at $46,000 and $53,000 respectively. So it's important to note that these figures do not include self-funded campaigns, because there is no provision that candidates who fully self-funded their campaigns had to disclose had to provide financial disclosures for those. So we do expect that there would be some difference if we had included those campaigns in this figure. So next, I'm going to talk about the total amount of money that was raised by all elected mayoral candidates across the 4 cities. So first of all, we can see that in Calgary, Mayor Nenshie's campaign in 2017 raised $536,000, and this is not including $119,889 that was carried over from his previous election. So what Bill talked about earlier about that rule change, this is one of the cases where there was a huge difference that came into a candidate's campaign because of the rule change. And that's compared to Mayor Iveson in Edmonton, who raised $350,000, and that is not including $44,000 that he carried over from his previous election. And another interesting thing to know about Calgary is that it was one of the rare cases when a winning candidate actually had not raised the most funds in their race. Bill Smith, who was Mayor Nenshie's main competitor, actually raised $916,288. $916,288. So we can see the huge amounts of money that was raised in the Calgary race. And then in comparison, in Edmonton, the mayoral candidate who raised the second most amount of funds was Fahad Mughal, who raised $22,000. So of which of that $88,803 was self-funded. So where we can see that Mayor Nenshie had a closer race in terms of funds raised, Mayor Iveson's closest competitor raised nearly 23 times less than he did. And then we can see in this figure that the difference is quite stark between Calgary and Edmonton and Lethbridge and Red Deer. So Chris Bierman, the mayor of Lethbridge, raised $5,461, while Tara Veer, the mayor of Red Deer, raised $10,450. So while these numbers are relatively small compared to the Calgary-Edmonton numbers, they do show the potential impact that a couple of wealthy donors who wanted to contribute the maximum $5,000 could actually support a candidate in these cities. It shows us the impact of those larger donations a bit more. And then our next figure shows us the average amount of money raised by all elected councillor candidates across all cities. So the first figure, the first bar there shows the amounts raised in Edmonton, which was an average of $70,000 raised by councillor candidates in Edmonton who were successful. And that's compared to $183,000 in Calgary. This is significantly higher than the amounts of funds raised by all losing councillor candidates. So the average amount of funds raised by losing candidates in Edmonton was $17,000. So we're comparing that to $70,000 for winning candidates. And in Calgary, the average amount of money raised by losing councillor candidates was $23,000. So again, we're comparing that to $183,000. So you can see the very large difference that the amount of funds raised actually made in the outcome of the race. And then in Red Deer and Lethbridge, again, these numbers are quite different. So Lethbridge, the average winning councillor candidate raised $3,922. That's compared to the losing candidate raised an average of $1,066. In Red Deer, the average winning councillor candidate raised $5,865, while the average losing candidate raised $1,327. So we can see the big discrepancies between the bigger cities and Lethbridge and Red Deer, as well as between winning and losing candidates in terms of how much money they raised. Okay, and then the advantage of being an incumbent. So this figure demonstrates the important role that being an incumbent played on raising funds. So since many larger contributors tend to support candidates who they already know are likely to win, they are more likely to put their financial support behind those candidates since it's less of a risk. So we can see in this figure, just the aggregate across all 4 cities, that the average incumbent candidate raised $103,000, while the average non-incumbent candidate raised $23,000. And then I've broken those down by city as well. So we can see in Edmonton that the incumbents raised on average $103,000 compared to all non-incumbents who raised $17,000. In Calgary, incumbents raised on average $250,000 compared to non-incumbents who raised on average $44,000. These numbers are similar in Red Deer. These proportions are similar in Red Deer and Lethbridge. So in Lethbridge, incumbents raised $3,699, while non-incumbents raised $1,392. And in Red Deer, the incumbents raised on average $5,091 compared to non-incumbents who raised, sorry, I lost my page there, $1,935. So again, we can see the very big role that being an incumbent played in the amount of money you were able to raise in your race, in your campaign. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so the next part I'm going to be talking about where campaign funds actually came from. And so very quickly about how we actually got this data. First, we went through our data set that included all the candidates' disclosure forms and their donations, and we noted whether that donation came from an individual, a corporation, a union or a labor organization, an association. So for example, there were some donations that came from NGOs, whether it came from fundraising events or the candidate themselves. So these were our categorizations. And then we also had a few donations that came from trusts and estates, but those were very few. And it is important to note here that fundraising events, the donations that came from fundraising events were not disclosed consistently throughout candidates' disclosure forms. So some candidates disclosed donations over $100 that came from fundraising events and some did not. So again, there might be some skewed results as a result of candidates not disclosing those numbers. Okay, so here's the first 2 charts that show the source of funds raised by winning candidates only in Edmonton and Calgary. So we can see that from successful candidates only, corporations provided 56% of campaign funds in Edmonton and 47% of funds in Calgary. Unions contributed 8% of all campaign funding in Edmonton and only 2% in Calgary. And fundraising events were only 3% in Edmonton, while they were 22% in Calgary. And again, that may be due to some candidates not disclosing how much money they were getting, how the donors, where the donations were coming from for fundraising events. This next graph shows, these next 2 graphs show the same disaggregation of where the funds were coming from for Lethbridge and Red Deer. So we can see in Lethbridge, corporations provided 39% of all funds, while in Red Deer, they provided only 24% of all funds. And we can also see a big difference between Lethbridge, Red Deer, and Calgary and Edmonton is that self-funding made up a much higher proportion of where the funds were coming from in Lethbridge and Red Deer compared to in Edmonton and Calgary, as a lot more candidates, successful candidates, were self-funding their campaigns in these 2 cities. And then this is just a more detailed breakdown of, again, where the funds were coming from for winning candidates in Edmonton. So some of the key takeaways here is that 63% of Mayor Iveson's campaign funds came from corporations, 36% came from individuals, and roughly 1% came from unions. And of all the councillors in Edmonton, Mike Nicol raised the most amount of money, with about 54% coming from corporations. In Calgary, sorry, this next table shows the same amounts in Calgary. So Mayor Nenshi raised about 20% of his total from 19% of his total from corporations, while 78% was coming from individuals. And this is an interesting number to note because I'll come back to it later, because a significant number of these individual donations were over $1,000. So they were coming from wealthy individual donors, not just very small donations. And the 2 Calgary aldermen who raised the most corporate money are Ward Sutherland, who raised $196,000, and Shane Keating, who raised $185,000. So this next table shows us the top corporate donors by city. So these were the top 5 corporate donors across Edmonton and Calgary, so who donated the most money to various candidates. And we can see that in Edmonton, it's interesting that these are all development corporations, major development corporations. So again, it's painting an interesting picture of who is supporting candidates. And then what I mentioned earlier, so this is the number of donors who donated over $1,000 in Calgary and Edmonton mayoral races. So for Mayor Nenshi, 99 people donated $1,000. So that totaled about 43% of his total funds raised were coming from individuals who donated $1,000 or more towards his campaign. For Bill Smith, this was a bit less. It was just about 46% of his, a bit more, 46% of his total funds raised were coming from people who donated $1,000 or more. And for Mayor Iveson's campaign, 22% of his total funds raised were coming from people who donated $1,000 or more. And then lastly, just quickly going to touch on some of the lack of enforcement of campaign finance rules and some of the major issues we identified as we were doing this research. So the first thing is that we noticed several discrepancies across candidates' disclosure forms. So between the numbers that they listed as their totals and the numbers that we calculated after summing up their disclosure forms. So some of these discrepancies were just off by a few dollars and some were as large as 50,000. So that may be because of technical difficulties in filling out their forms or indicates that they were not being filled out correctly. Another big one was that Sean Yost in the Calgary race donated $64,000 to his own campaign, which is far over the limit of $10,000 that is set out by the election rules. And this was actually reported on by the Toronto Star, but they noted that in order to hold him accountable, someone would have to take him to court. And so nothing has come of that. And there's been no accountability, despite this being a glaring violation of campaign rules. One candidate in Edmonton, their disclosure form was just a blank page. So they listed a disclosure, but the following page was just blank, which seems like just a technical error in the scanning, but again, demonstrates that no one is checking these disclosure forms for correction or even that to check if they were uploaded. And then another interesting one was that for Mayor Iveson's campaign, there was a Donald Wheaton who donated $5,000, which is the maximum amount an individual can donate, and then a Donald C. Wheaton who donated $1,000. Which might be a different person, but if not, indicates another violation of a campaign rule. And we also noticed that Wheaton Investments donated $5,000 to Mayor Iveson's campaign. So again, demonstrating how people may be circumventing campaign rules by donating more than their allotted amount. So that is all from me, Bill. I will hand it over to you again.
Thanks, Aye. That was wonderful. There's so much information that we were digging through. So it's, yeah, challenging to present it all in such quick time, but you did a great job on that. I'm just gonna share my screen again if I could. I just need to, sorry, get down to the right slide. Sorry, people, it's just the joy of Zoom. There we go. Just the last couple slides, if we can. Here we are. There we go. Okay, so what are the conclusions and recommendations that we need to bring forward from this? So, you know, from our view, of course, and I'm sure many of you out there share that we feel elections absolutely need to be more fair and democratic. And not just based on how much funding you have to get your message out. We note that the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association has a pledge that they're calling upon all candidates to have, and it has a number of very excellent points in it. And one of them calls on candidates to disclose their campaign finances prior to the election. So we know some candidates across Alberta have already done that. You can go to their websites, you can check it out and see what they've put out in terms of their own disclosures in advance of the election. And so that's a key thing that we want to make sure people are asking their candidates prior to the election as to where they stand on this and whether or not they will disclose in advance. So we have a number of recommendations, though, and these are recommendations that we're very interested in hearing your feedback on. Maybe you think we go too far or not far enough on some of these, but we think if the province were to implement changes to the Local Areas Elections Act in these veins, we would have far fairer elections going forward. So the first one is to limit the amount of campaign contributions that individuals to a maximum actually of $1,000 is what we're calling upon to any one candidate for a total of 4,000 maximum in contributions across the election. We'll just note that in Toronto, the city of Toronto, the maximum you can contribute there is $1,200. So we think $1,000 is fair. I'm sure a lot of people out there do not have extra thousands laying around to throw out. So we think that would be a good amount. We feel that the regulations that were already, or the section that was already created under the LEA that allows for regulations to limit campaign spendings need to be acted upon. And so we need to establish those campaign spending limits at the top end. And we feel that a way to do that is to consult with all the councils across the province, but maximum should be the average that is raised by councillors or mayors for each city going forward. Candidates should be allowed to contribute a maximum of $4,000 to their own campaign total, not $10,000 like they currently have. And candidates should not be allowed to raise any funds prior to the election period until they are nominated for the election. This will take away the advantage of incumbents so that everyone has the same starting point, January 1st of the year in which the election is, in which to get out, raise the funds, and to move forward with that. We also think, and some jurisdictions are exploring this around the world, that in order to support a greater diversity of candidates, all candidates should be given a basic stipend amount of public funding based on the size of the city or town's voting population. As you saw from Saeed's information, we need more money in big cities in order to run proper campaigns compared to small ones. So why couldn't we have public funding that could support all candidates with a base level amount going forward? And that, when you add it up, the numbers would not be that high. Campaign contributions to a municipal campaign should be given a tax receipt, similar to how contributions are received for provincial and federal elections. Why is it when we contribute at the municipal level, we don't get a tax receipt, but we do when we do at a federal level? Candidates should be required to file a disclosure statement that outlines all campaign contributions over $50 1 month before the municipal election. If we could have that disclosure in advance, then people would have a clear understanding as to who's funding which campaigns. And finally, each municipality needs to proactively review all disclosure forms to clarify any discrepancies with the candidates, report all potential breaches of the LEA to Elections Alberta to investigate, and we need to impose more extensive fines if candidates have broken the law. Saeed mentioned about that one candidate having a blank statement. When we contacted the city of Edmonton, they just said, oh no, we just upload these documents. We don't actually look at them. Why is it that we have a law that nobody is actually looking at to make sure that people are actually following the rules? So with that, I want to just close. Again, thank everybody for your participation and look forward to your questions and answers.
Great, thanks, Say. Thanks, Bill. Massive kudos to you both for doing that work on such short notice. It's a tremendous amount of research, and we really appreciate it. It's really interesting to see, for example, that 64% of donations that went to our outgoing mayor's campaign came from corporations, not individuals or unions, in the last election. And it's interesting to see that snapshot for sure. So we're going to turn it over to questions now. So if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A chat, not the chat, the Q&A below, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Before we jump in though, I kind of want to just ask a really general question, one to each of our guests here. So Jacqueline, just for you, maybe if you could start us off, I'm curious in your report, the question, is it an unfair deal that the cities are getting in our communities? And then kind of flipping that, if you could just talk to us a little bit about what your thoughts are on what a more fair deal or a fair deal might look like when it comes to, sustainable funding and, predictability and all the things that you heard from the 10 municipalities that you talked to.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, so one thing that kept coming up throughout all the interviews was the fact that I'm sure most people here tonight are aware of the fact that when they pay property taxes, a good chunk of these property taxes are actually forwarded on from the municipality that you live in to the province in the form of education property taxes. So this is usually about a third of your total tax bill gets forwarded on to the province. A lot of interviewees brought up the fact that, you know, these the amount of money that municipalities forward to the province is roughly the same. Sometimes it's actually even more than the money that they get back in the form of transfers and grants from the province. So a lot of interviewees said, especially, and I think that there are potentially different concerns when you're dealing with like the large Edmonton, Calgary that have these huge administrative capacities and you know, have bigger populations in some provinces, all the territories, you know, like they're very capable. I don't like the word corporation. Sometimes they refer to themselves as that, but entities, right? And so they argued, many of these counselors that I interviewed, just let us just keep all the property tax. And then we don't need any transfers. We don't need any grants. We know what our priorities are. We know how to manage the money. It eliminates this kind of like administrative burden of sending it to the province, who then gets to send it back to cities, but forces cities to, you know, meet certain criteria or privileges some projects over others. So that was one really common thing that arose a lot, and I think is a pretty interesting way to think of it, right? The cities aren't necessarily advocating for more funding, although I guess they are advocating not for the cuts. They want the cuts to be reversed, but really they would just like the tools to be able to generate revenue sustainably and have that stability there into the long term, so they're not dealing with all these ups and downs and the whims of whatever government might be in power at that time. Yeah, so that's probably the biggest one that we received.
Great. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I'm going to jump right into the questions because we have a whole bunch and we're already at 8 o'clock. So the first question is about electoral financing and enforcement, which you both talked a little bit about here. So can you, either Sae or Bill, maybe both of you, clarify why people have to take candidates to court for accountability over financing disclosure violations? And there's an example that's referenced from Calgary. And yeah, why we have to do that?
That is a very good question. And in fact, as I indicated at the beginning, when the NDP changed the act back in 2018, one of the key things they did was to empower the elections commissioner to investigate infractions of the act. We also know subsequently the UCP have, through another bill, when they came in, eliminated the election commissioner's position. So it is unclear to us exactly who is responsible, and it was certainly unclear to the folks at the city of Edmonton when we inquired as to who is responsible for analyzing the breaches. And you know, there's a $5,000 fine, but we have no indication that that's ever been applied and stuff. So the article that we found that Sae referenced made it very clear, though, that in order to have someone taken to brought up on this and be charged $5,000, an individual would have to take them to court, and we think that that's just completely wrong. So the question is a good one. The answer is we need to change the law to make sure that someone is responsible for looking at this, and that the law is applied where people breach it.
And I did just send the article in the chat that details what process the person went through and what responses they got about how to pursue this violation of campaign law. So that lays out the information they got at the time.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Sae. The question here, Well, here's Maeve, everyone. A question here from Cody. Sort of the classic kind of like manufactured crisis and privatization question. And so Jacqueline, when we're thinking about our healthcare system in Alberta sort of being under siege, and then the new health minister talking a lot about basically that they want to expand capacity by getting private providers to provide private surgeries. Is there an analogy between that example that we're experiencing now here in Alberta and cuts to municipalities leading to municipal, governments having to make tough decisions about, sewage, water, and other services that are at the municipal level, and looking to outsource, privatize, and contract out? Did you experience that or hear that from anybody that you talked to?
No, I didn't. I did see that in the Q&A, and it really made me think. It's an interesting point I'd never really thought of before. So I haven't heard or encountered too much evidence of that angle. There's very few provincial transfers or grants that are in place for like water infrastructure, the kinds of stuff that you normally pay fees for, because they're not public, or what's the term, like non-excludable public goods in the same way that roads are, and parks, and other public spaces that you can't really monetize the same way. I guess you could also say like subsidizing transit, these sorts of things. It's very difficult, even when you look at the states where municipal revenues have really been hamstrung, even more so than here, even though they have access to like a sales tax and these sorts of things. You don't see too much evidence of the privatization of municipal services. Usually you see, if anything, more, yes, private entities managing maybe water, sewage, power, these sorts of things. But when you're talking more about just like the public spaces and the quality of your infrastructure, public infrastructure, really you just see more of like a crumbling and a deterioration of the infrastructure, and a shift towards infrastructure that makes like financial sense. So in the US, this means building like convention centers and airports and these sorts of things, and sports stadiums, instead of public spaces that everybody can benefit from. So, I mean, this is something to keep an eye out from. I haven't seen too much evidence of this happening in Alberta, but it's a super interesting point.
I'd like to jump in if I could, Brad, on that, because I'm not sure in Calgary, Jacqueline, but certainly here in Edmonton, we see candidates already positioning themselves, talking about how bad the finances are and how we're going to have to tighten our belts, etc. And oftentimes they're explicit, or it's sort of hidden in what they're saying, that they will actually be looking at privatization, and they'll use that excuse to say, well, our finances are so tough, and therefore we have to do this because it's somehow going to save taxpayers money. And that's why I think your report is so important, Jacqueline, because it shows the big picture of how the province in many ways is the one that's creating that very challenging fiscal situation for the cities, that the cities then have to respond to. And the questioner is right that one of the answers to that some of the candidates are going to push forward is, oh, we're just going to privatize that pool, or we're going to sell off that hockey rink, etc. And some corporation can run it for a profit and take it off our books, etc., etc. So I think we're going to see that a lot more over the next number of years, again, depending on the candidates that are selected on October 18th.
Great. Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Bill. So we have a question about the difference between what the NDP rules were when it came to disclosure of campaign contributions versus any UCP changes in the last few years. I think you touched on that a little bit in terms of campaign contribution limits, but specifically on disclosure, were there any changes over the last couple of years that you came across, IA or Bill?
So I'll just jump in on that. Yeah, we did talk about that a little bit. The NDP said they had to disclose anything above $50. The UCP has put it back up to $100. Neither of them actually said that you had to disclose in advance of the election. And that's a key thing that now the AUMA and others are actually calling upon, is that we want disclosures in advance. At the provincial level, I think most people know, or hope you know, that every quarter all the political parties have to file their campaign contributions, and you can go to Elections Alberta and track how much they're raising and from whom. So we again don't see any reason why there can't be some rules in place to make sure that all candidates have to disclose. What we're suggesting is a month before the election, so that that's nomination day, so that people can clearly see how much they'd raised from January through to that September date.
Great. Wanted to ask a question sort of related to some of the conversation that we're seeing about, delivering services without willing partners at the province. And in the report, Jacqueline, you talked a little bit about housing in particular. And there was an interview, I think it was Councillor Knack, who said that, we wanted to build X number of new affordable housing spaces, but without the $6 million in operating funds from the province, our hands were tied. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And like, is it the case that the city can't find creative ways to make up for that operational funding if they wanted to, or is it necessary to have the province at the table as the responsible partner for affordable housing? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so actually in this province, the province owns the affordable house, like it's considered provincial jurisdiction, and then cities are stewards of the property. So cities are responsible for running these sorts of things, but the province is supposed to pay for their upkeep and their regular maintenance and these sorts of things. So I mean, not even getting into the money that was kind of left on the federal money being left on the table, but you're just seeing all these, I know at least for sure in Calgary, I don't know if this is as much the case in Edmonton, but that affordable housing units, despite massive demand, are actually getting shut down because they just simply do not have the funds to adequately maintain them. And because it is kind of this gray area, I mean, most people don't really know that affordable housing, and when you think of like the Calgary Housing Corporation, you don't really think of it as being like a provincial obligation. And so I think that the province can kind of, it's just not as visible, and it's a bit more difficult to criticize the province for it. That being said, when we look, yeah, there is federal money for the federal government. Currently has a $1 billion rapid housing initiative, of which Edmonton was seeking, I forget the exact amount of funding. I believe it was for a 414 units supportive housing facility. And yes, they just needed, Edmonton was willing to put up the bulk of the money to match the federal government. All they needed was that 6 million guarantee from the province in order to ensure that it could be operated, and they weren't able to get that. And so, yes, of course, there's creative solutions. You can work with different nonprofits, different groups, try to find synergies with businesses, but ultimately this is just a lot. And there are creative ways out there. People are doing them, but for the scale of the challenge needed, you really need the province to come to the table, and we can't just be relying on, these so-called like creative solutions, which are great, these kind of one-off projects, but it's not really a sustainable, like long-term plan to fix affordable housing in our cities.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We have another question that is about property tax revenue, and we kind of touched on it a bit, but are there any other provinces that just allow municipalities to keep 100% of property tax revenue?
No, there's not. There are some provinces where there is more of like a city charter agreement, like the one Calgary and Edmonton we're trying to make, where the bigger cities like Toronto and Vancouver are able to access a little bit more flexible funding tools and given a bit more latitude and responsibility.
Okay, it's interesting. It's been coming up a little bit with some of our candidates here in Edmonton and Calgary about, yeah, just sort of like opening on to that conversation about that 30 or 40% that automatically goes back, and at least asking questions about where it's going, not just into general revenue.
You're breaking up with me. Is it just me or is
my audio working? No.
It is now, yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna go off video here because I'm a little bit shaky here on my connection. Sorry about that. Where is the UCP getting their ideas from? Is it Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario? What other provinces are they, or are they just coming up with these great ideas on their own when it comes to electoral financing rules? Maybe to Bill and Saye.
That is a mystery question. You know, the campaign finance rules do vary across the country. We have not had a chance to analyze all the provinces and see whether or not they're replicating what has gone on in other provinces. We have done some research with respect to other jurisdictions and down in the US and other states, and clearly see that a lot of the European countries have far stronger campaign rules, and in the US for that matter as well, for municipalities. But in the US, as we also know, the corporate funding for elections is huge, particularly the political action committees and the third-party advertising. One of the key things the UCP also did change is they took out third-party advertising from the rules related to that were associated with political action committees. So a political action committee is a group of people that will come together to say, we're going to put money together to back candidate X, and we're going to talk about how wonderful candidate X is, etc. What they have said, though, is if you're just going to go out and promote a particular idea, or like we want to have more candidates invest in parks, but that's not under the rules as well. So there's been some changes in that regard, and corporations and unions are allowed to contribute to those, and the maximum is $30,000 for corporations. We do see a number of PACs established in Calgary in particular. Unfortunately, we were not able to include all of those details within our fact sheet that we'll be releasing next week, though. So I don't know if you want to pick up on that from your experience in other jurisdictions.
I know very little about municipal politics in other provinces, so this is my limited amount of information.
Sounds like we have general consensus in the chat that it's probably ripped off from the United States and other great places with very minimal rules. That's really good. Just for clarity on the current electoral financing rules when it comes to contribution limits, the 5,000 maximum donation to any candidate. Just really quickly, was this a UCP government change? And what was the rule, or what was the contribution limit before the UCP made that change?
So yeah, just to be clear, the research that I did that we're presenting today was from the last election, 2017. And those rules were actually in place from the previous progressive conservative government. And the maximum contribution was $5,000 at the time. But you could contribute to more than one candidate, $5,000. And so the NDP changed that in 2018 after the last election. And so those NDP rules have never been used to run an election because the UCP made the changes that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation, where now candidate or individuals can give $5,000 to as many candidates out there as they want to. So I hope that clarifies it. Say, do you want to add to that?
Yep, that definitely clarifies.
If you don't mind me just jumping in, what do you think the what changes do you expect then to see this election or the ones that follow given these changes?
Well, one of the things we want to do is when all the candidates are required to disclose by March 1st of 2022. So once that is, all those disclosures across the province are in, we will absolutely, we're going to try and raise some money to do more research into this and to look at this. Certainly this municipal election is the first time that corporations and unions are not allowed to contribute directly to candidates. So we're wondering what impact that's going to have on the amount of money that candidates are actually able to raise from individuals. Or does it just mean that wealthy individuals are required to step up that much more to back the candidates that they want to have in order for them to have significant campaigns? So that's research that we intend to do starting next spring, assuming we can raise the funds and what have you ourselves to do that research. Okay.
Yeah, and what we saw with, I think the example I mentioned with Mayor Iveson's campaign with Donald Wheaton and Wheaton Investments, there's a few other cases where you had either CEOs or people very high up in these big corporations donating as individuals. So something we might expect to see if corporations aren't allowed to donate is having more of those people high up in corporations donating as individuals, but still donating the maximum amount. So still trying to make that, have that influence on candidates' campaigns.
Yeah, or giving money to their staff to donate.
Yeah, exactly. Highly encouraged amongst the staff. So we have a question here about property taxes and school taxes and kind of making ends meet year over year in municipalities. Is it possible to provide services and keep up with infrastructure investments with just property taxes and other revenue that's mostly in the control of municipalities? It seems like, in context here, it seems like infrastructure is getting delayed, and that we're never going to be able to catch up. So just maybe some freestyling on that, Jacqueline, if you have any thoughts.
I mean, it is certainly possible if municipalities were able to, and especially the big cities were able to retain the entire portion of the property taxes, that would more than serve their needs. If we're talking about could they survive solely on the own source revenue sources that they currently have access to with no revenue from the province, it would be very tight. And what this would basically mean is that you would not have any new large infrastructure projects without some sort of like privatization angle, these sorts of things. Also, unlike cities in the US, municipalities here in Alberta have faced more constraints in terms of their like borrowing and issuing things like bonds and whatnot. So yes, if cities could retain all their property taxes, it would more than cover their needs and help them invest for the long term. But with what they have now, they would really just be going kind of like pothole to pothole and making sure that the bare minimum, maintenance was done on existing assets.
Right. And there was kind of a phrase in your report, Jacqueline, that said, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was kind of about like choosing your own adventure or leaving room for the imagination, or like, planning for everything to change when it comes to like investments, from being able to do, capital projects, because it seems like, from MSI to the, now the LGFF and the city charger framework before that it's got to be really hard to do any long-term planning if you're at the municipal level with that kind of a so-called partner. So it's a really challenging thing. We have a couple more questions here. One sort of about, like, I guess, I mean, kind of speculation, but what, Saye and Bill and Jacqueline too, if you have any thoughts, do you think the motivation was for the current UCP government to make the changes to third-party electoral financing rules and PACs and third parties? Yeah, like in Calgary, if anybody was paying attention, I think, it was pretty clear that Bill Smith had a lot of support from outside of his campaign. You couldn't avoid his face at Flames games and anywhere in the city. And so, yeah, if you have any thoughts about what, kind of maybe some of the intention was around opening up those rules, and maybe some of what those changes have been for third parties being allowed to play in the sandbox a little bit more these days.
Well, there's no question that a lot of the more well-off supporters of the UCP and who also play at the municipal level, very frustrated with what happened to their attempts to defeat Mayor Nemshi in the last election. As Saye pointed out, they raised over $900,000 for Bill Smith. So that is one of the things very important to point out, that just because you've raised more money doesn't mean you're necessarily going to win. But as you said, if the money is there, they're really able to get the message out, etc. So I think with the changes they've made, it's clear that they were lobbied by probably wealthy individuals who have more than $5,000 to give to candidates, multiple candidates, and they felt that this was the way to be able to ensure that candidates that are needing that money are going to be singing the tune that they, in terms of all of the things that some of these corporations are looking for, which is, as we know, the songbook deregulation and privatization and cutting their taxes, et cetera, and making sure that the rest of us are living in austerity and cuts to our public services. So, most candidates out there, I think, go in because they want to serve their communities and their public, and then are probably very frustrated to see that they're maybe able to raise $20,000 where their competitors got 5 times that amount, and they know that they're not on the level playing field. So that's why I think it's so important that, as Jacqueline was saying for her report, these municipal issues are provincial issues. And so after the municipal elections, we need to keep advocating for a more fair democratic system. And campaign finance is just really one aspect of broader changes that I know Public Interest Alberta has been advocating for years. And so that's why it's so important to have the advocacy work that PIA does, and research and people aware that these elections can be made far more democratic if we get our voices heard.
Great. Thanks, Bill. And thanks, Jacqueline, for answering Bev's question in the chat there. Appreciate it. I wanted to mention too, there's a question about whether or not Public Interest Alberta is supporting or endorsing candidates in the municipal election. We are not endorsing candidates, but I would encourage everyone to check out our municipal election campaign and website. We interviewed all the mayoral candidates who wanted to talk to us, and we have videos of those interviews from the Calgary and Edmonton candidates, as well as surveys from well over 100 candidates from across the school board races and council races across the province. So we asked them all the same 8 questions, and we'd love for you to be able to check that out and see what they had to say about a whole range of things regarding public interest and public service issues. If you want to make a donation to Parkland, you can go to their website, or just probably go to their website. I'm sure there's a link there right at the top or right on the main page. Great, Bill's nodding. And I'm sure he'll be happy to see that there's going to be funding for the March report and other things. Wanted to say thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. These are really critical issues, and there's so much change that's happened in municipal legislation. It's really hard to keep up, but it's a big opportunity for us to engage in this really critical election. If you haven't had a chance to vote yet, advanced polling locations are open. Go to your city of Edmonton or Calgary or Lethbridge.
We lost you.
Oh no, we lost Brad. He was just on a roll there. Well, I guess I'll pick up where Brad left off. He's having some internet issues. Oh, there he is.
Oh, sorry, folks.
Brad, you cut it.
Did I cut out again? Oh, geez. My internet's not good here in Ritchie. But just wanted to say thank you. Go vote. Appreciate your time. And maybe I'll turn it over to Jacqueline, Bill, and say if you want to have any final words.
Oh, I don't have many final words. I really appreciate you all being here tonight and waiting to hear what we had to say before you go out and vote. But of course, that's the most important thing. And looking forward to seeing what happens 2 weeks from now.
And Sayed.
Thank you all for showing up, and yeah, vote. And we'll read our report when it comes out early next week. A lot more detail in there than we managed to get through in this presentation.
Yeah, and I just want to again thank Brad and Laura at Public Interest Alberta for co-hosting this event with Parkland Institute and helping us get the research out. Parkland does the research and the information so that we can put it into your hands, all the people that are out there, so you can use it as a tool to help advocate for a better future, as Brad was saying. And in speaking of that, we actually do have a couple of events coming up that Parkland Institute is hosting. Just yesterday, we launched a new report on the future of post-secondary education with a lot of our partners from across the province, faculty, students, staff from institutions all over the province. Got a lot of great media attention on that. And today, the Minister of Advanced Education seemed to be quite upset, tweeting about that as well. So we're having an event on October 21st. You will, if you're not on our email list, you can go and to Eventbrite and look that up and register for that free event to talk about the future of post-secondary education. And then our 25th annual conference, I can't believe it's 25 years, is going to be happening on November 19th to 21st. We were hoping to do it in person, but it's unfortunately having to go virtual. We're super excited though. We have Pam Palmater as our keynote speaker on Friday night. Kate Raworth, the author of Donut Economics, is speaking on Saturday morning, and we have Jim Stanford and a whole bunch of other amazing speakers and people that are going to be at the conference. So we will be rolling out our registration for that in the coming weeks. So please look forward to that. And I'll turn it back to you, Brad. Thanks again for everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Sae. Thank you, Jacqueline. That was very informative and exciting. And please do consider becoming a member of Public Interest Alberta. You can do that at our website, pialberta.org. We have a lot of exciting things going on right now, and we're really focused on the municipal election. So if you want to get involved, check out what we have going on our website, sign up to our newsletter, and stay involved with Parkland and Public Interest Alberta. And yeah, have fun out there, stay safe and stay warm, and go vote. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.